Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Cosplaying Caesar, Napoleon in Egypt Part 1 by Extra History. Now, when I saw that Extra History was releasing this series, I was very excited because for a while now, I've wanted to do some content on Napoleon's time in Egypt. If you've seen our channel before, you'll know that we're big fans of Napoleon here. We've done a lot of Napoleon-related content, but we haven't been able to give that much attention to his time in Egypt. So I'm very excited that we are finally getting that opportunity. Now, if you guys would like to see extra exclusive content, then please check out my Patreon. It is linked down below. And with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
French flagship Orient, July 1st, 1798. Napoleon Bonaparte stands in front of his troops. He reveals that within hours, they will land in Egypt. Soon, he says, they will defeat the Mameluke sultans, then they will stay as an occupying force. The people amongst whom we're going to live are Muslims, he says, their first article of faith being this: there is but one God, and Muhammad is his prophet. Do not contradict them. He then reminds the army that their forerunners, the Roman legions, protected all religions.
There's a lot of interesting stuff here, you know. Why was Napoleon headed to Egypt? What exactly did he plan to do while he was there? How did he approach the people of the region? How did he approach Islam? A lot of really fascinating stuff that I'm not going to get into now because I'm sure we'll get into all of these topics throughout this entire series.
He insists that Egyptian Muslims be treated with the same respect the army has shown Christians and Jews, and that their rituals...
Which is a little funny because the French Revolution was actually a bit anti-Christian. I mean, it was very secular, and it certainly persecuted Catholics at times. So, you know, talking about the same respect it shows Jews and Christians, the French revolutionaries had a very mixed relationship with even the Christian religion. Not to mention Jews, even though they had gained a lot of rights through the revolution, still certainly faced discrimination in France. But anyway.
Mosques and priests are not to be interfered with, and soldiers must accommodate Muslim ways, even though their treatment of women differs from Europe. Now, the first town we shall come to was built by Alexander, he says, suggesting that they'll emulate the great conqueror's success.
Yes, and from Napoleon's writings, we know that while he was going through this Egyptian campaign, he was marching around this territory, Napoleon was absolutely thinking of those great conquerors of old, your Alexanders, your Caesars. He was thinking of them, and he was clearly comparing himself to them. You know, at this point, Napoleon had already started to think of himself as one of these great conquerors, one of these great men of history. Now, Napoleon still had a long career ahead of him, and he hadn't achieved his greatest accomplishments yet, but we can already see sort of what Napoleon thinks of himself, the sort of building ego over time, and this also might give us a bit of an insight into one of the many reasons that Napoleon might have went to Egypt.
But, and I hate to do this at the beginning of the series, spoiler alert, they're not gonna.
Well, yes. The whole thing ended up not being super successful.
Thanks so much to Factor for keeping us well fed on a historically busy schedule. The French invasion of Egypt in 1798 is sometimes treated like a sideshow in the Napoleonic Wars.
Yes, and, you know, you can understand why. When we look at all of Napoleon's campaigns, his time in Egypt is probably the least relevant to the story of Napoleon as a whole. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't important in its own ways. It may not have the same gravitas or the same major immediate impact that some of these other campaigns had on Europe or on Napoleon's legacy, but his time in Egypt certainly had an impact on Napoleon, on Europe, on the people of Egypt, the people of the region more broadly. You know, there's a lot of interesting stuff we can learn from this time period.
Just one of many rungs in a ladder that helped Napoleon to power while inventing Egyptology as a byproduct. But this view is vastly underselling it as an event, especially since it centers on how it impacted Europe rather than a wider picture of how it also affected North Africa and the Middle East.
Yeah, and that's a key point. You know, when we think about the Napoleonic Wars and Napoleon as a historical figure, oftentimes we look at him from a European context, which, of course, makes sense. I mean, Napoleon did most of what he did within a European context. But if we're looking at the Egyptian campaign in particular, then it sort of serves us to zoom out a little bit, look at the broader global effects of what went on here.
This was the first time since the Crusades that European armies had invaded the region, and this time they came armed with vastly superior weapons technology and an intention to bring Enlightenment ideals in order to liberate the people there. In other words, it's not only frequently cited as the first modern colonialist project, it will also set some patterns that will look all too familiar to the more modern Western interventions in the Middle East.
Yeah, it's sort of an interesting situation. Of course, everything has nuance to it. It's not like you can take Napoleon's campaign in Egypt and draw a direct line to the colonization efforts of the future. It was not exactly the same. Plus, a lot of this was done on the initiative of Napoleon himself. In many ways, this was the project of a single man. Now, of course, it was broader than that, but Napoleon really did sort of individually push this. But what they're saying is on some level true and also very interesting. We see this European incursion in the Middle East, but Napoleon tries to frame it in a very different light than the Crusades of old. He says, we're coming to liberate the people from their oppressive rulers. We're coming to enlighten them, to introduce to them the ideas of freedom. We're here to respect their religion and their beliefs, not to oppress and conquer them. Now, of course, on some level, that is not entirely true. It's interesting, with Napoleon, you always get a mix of his genuine beliefs and then whatever he's saying to justify the conquest that he's performing at the moment. And that's how you can see a bit of a relationship to, colonialism. So it is a real interesting mix of these Enlightenment ideals, blatant colonialism, Napoleon building his own legacy and career. We see a lot of this in this Egyptian campaign.
During his invasion, Napoleon would try to secure his hold by removing an unpopular regime, installing allies, appealing to religious commonalities, and exploiting ethnic, religious, and political division for his own benefit. Now, of course, I hear you asking, is this gonna get cringe? To which I will respond with a resounding, oh yeah. I'm talking like Napoleon wearing a turban, proclaiming himself a champion of Islam, and wanting to unite all Muslim nations under one banner level of cringe.
Yes, it will get a little cringe, and once again, I don't want to get too much into this right now, because we're going to get plenty of opportunities to talk about it throughout the series, but Napoleon really does flirt with Islam a lot during this time period. He tries to frame himself as a friend of Islam, a protector of the faith, but in the end, he refuses to actually convert. And this has led some people to believe that, Napoleon actually wanted to convert to Islam. Napoleon was secretly a Muslim. This is not true. Napoleon was actually a more secular individual, but if he was any religion, he was probably Catholic. But, as I said, largely a secular man, though he became more religious the older he got. This is primarily Napoleon using religion as a tool of conquest. But a very interesting thing to see, this European, supposedly Christian European coming to the region and moseying up so close to Islam, definitely an odd thing to see at the time.
We'll get there. But right now, it's May 1798, and troops are flooding into the French Mediterranean port of Toulon. There are 40,000 soldiers in the harbor, 27 fighting ships, 400 transports, and a dozen generals. Some of the most famous commanders in France are here. The swashbuckling Caribbean raised
Yes.
Thomas Alexandre Dumas.
And we've done a video on Thomas Alexander Dumas, a real interesting character. As you can see, a black officer during the Napoleonic Wars. That was a pretty unique identity to have at the time. It was still difficult for black men to rise through the ranks in France, so he was a real exceptional individual, and he has a really fascinating story. You should check out that reaction if you get the opportunity, but we'll get plenty of chances to talk about him during this series.
The former nobleman and revolutionary Jacques-François Minois, who kept international security for France for half a decade. The hero of the revolution, Jean-Baptiste Kléber, known for stubbornly holding out against royalist forces. And none of them know where they're going. Some suppose it's an attempt to kick Admiral Nelson of...
Like I said, this was a project really pushed by Napoleon and sort of kept under wraps by Napoleon until it was quite late. Also, we see some characters throughout this series, not Horatio Nelson, he'll be relevant to the entire Napoleonic Wars, but we see some characters like those just depicted who have sort of an outsized role in the Egyptian campaign and appear much less throughout the remainder of the Napoleonic Wars, so an interesting cast of characters we've been introduced to.
Britain's Royal Navy out of the Mediterranean, though others say they'll sail through Gibraltar and commence the long-rumored invasion of England. Though neither of those ideas really make sense. This force is too small to invade Britain, and their company includes a delegation of 151 savants, mathematicians, chemists, linguists, and masters of natural science who seem to think they're about to study a mysterious new land. Nah, no matter. Wherever they go, they're gonna win. For Napoleon, though. But just so we can all catch up, who exactly is this mathematician turned artillery officer?
Yeah, let's give a bit of a background on Napoleon at this point, this is a real interesting point in Napoleon's career. As I mentioned earlier, he has not really achieved the things that will make him truly legendary, but he is already pretty accomplished at this point. He's pretty well known. He has built himself a reputation and a legacy, so we're sort of at this interesting middle point of his career.
Napoleon Bonaparte had risen to prominence in France by playing a key role in the uprising of 1795, when a royalist force had tried to enter Paris during a constitutional convention and seize control of the government. Napoleon had saved the day, slaughtering the incoming royalists with cannons, while the
Yes, there's a very famous quote about Napoleon using a whiff of grape shot, aka that style of artillery, for he was an artillery officer, to fend off these royalist rebels, saving the government of the time, who then went on to repay Napoleon.
Politicians tried to figure out a government that would prove stable enough to endure, while also preserving the revolution's ideals. The resulting government was a 5-member committee called the Directory, and Bonaparte was their new favorite hero. As Napoleon's star ascended, he gained wealth, married a woman with powerful political connections.
Though, they talk about the Directory trying to be a functional government while also maintaining the ideals of the revolution. Let's be honest, the Directory basically maintained no ideals. It was a body of supremely corrupt and opportunistic men, because at this point in the revolution, only the most opportunistic and corrupt had been able to survive. And when they governed, well, they governed in a corrupt and opportunistic way. A lot of the promise and the ideals of the revolution had sort of faded over the years. I mean, of course, prior we'd had the Reign of Terror under Robespierre. It had brought a lot of violence. A lot of people had become disillusioned. So the revolution has kind of faltered a little bit. And we can sort of see, in many ways, over these couple of years in the mid to late 1790s, the slow build-up to Napoleon's takeover. But that's a bit in the future. We're just seeing some interesting political trends at the time.
And gained command of the war in Italy. Within months, he'd broken the years-long stagnation there, soon secured an Austrian withdrawal, made war on the Pope, and smashed the Papal States. But by 1798, he was already thinking about what to do next. And honestly, so was the Directory, who was increasingly alarmed by this 28-year-old wonder kid.
Yes, exactly. And that's why I say this is a real interesting point in Napoleon's career. He's seen much military success in Italy. He's built his political reputation. But he has not achieved the great European military campaigns of his future, and he has not gained the political position that he will gain in his future. He is right in the middle, right on the cusp of doing all of that. And that's why Egypt is such an interesting point, because it's like Napoleon trying to decide what his next step should be, and he decided it would be Egypt. And as they're pointing out, the Directory was starting to get a little bit nervous. I mean, Napoleon had saved their government against a royalist rebellion, but now Napoleon was getting powerful, famous, wealthy, beloved by many of the French people, and in fact, he was becoming a lot more beloved than their unpopular government was. Remember that corrupt and opportunistic government, unsurprisingly, wasn't too popular with the people, whereas the victorious general, now he was pretty popular.
Napoleon was ruthless, competent, and ambitious, with an inherent knack of self-aggrandizing propaganda. He also further enriched himself, looting the treasures of Italy, meaning that the Caesar comparisons were getting real uncomfortable. Now, they wanted him to invade England,
And the Directory was very worried. They tried to restrict their generals from operating independently, but first off, when you are a general, you need some degree of independence from the government to actually operate effectively. And secondly, when you're winning all these battles, gaining this amount of power, you start to operate independently regardless of what the government wants. And that's what Napoleon has been doing. And as they said, there's been a lot of comparisons to Caesar, which, as you can imagine, makes the Directory very nervous. You know, Caesar, this general who had gained fame and popularity through both his political career and his military successes, who had then marched back to Rome and taken over. They're starting to worry that Napoleon will do the exact same thing. And, well, look at the rest of Napoleon's career. That's, in one way or another, basically what he will do. He will leverage those political connections and that military career in order to take over the government.
Getting him as far from the capital as possible, but Napoleon was dubious whether that would work. Instead, he proposed to capture Egypt. See, Egypt presented an indirect path toward attacking Britain. While British ship traffic to India went around Africa, message traffic went overland across Egypt to the Red Sea. And with that route conquered, French forces could link up with France's ally, the Tipu Sultan, who was at this time bedeviling the East India Company forces on the subcontinent.
Yes. So, this is one of the reasons that Napoleon headed for Egypt. At the moment, France's biggest concern is Britain, and that will be true throughout a lot of the Napoleonic Wars. They will have more immediate enemies, but Britain will always be a thorn in their side. France is worried about Britain, and instead of making a direct assault on the British Isles, which Napoleon doesn't think is a good idea, and it is certainly very risky, probably wouldn't work, he instead tries to tackle the issue of Britain in a more global and geopolitical way. You know, he wants to tackle their supply lines, their lines of communication. Of course, Britain relies on its growing colonial and global empire, and so Napoleon is sort of aiming to take a hit against that.
Napoleon also argued that sugar production in the region could take the place of France's loss of Haiti, which you can watch our series on here, and it could open new avenues of trade. Besides, they could tear down the Mameluke sultans, who had oppressed French traders living in the area, and bring the liberty of the revolution to this backwards land. But honestly, there was also a more romantic reason. Enlightenment thinkers were students of the classical world, raised on the stories of the Greeks, Romans, and pharaohs. As the most ancient of the classical empires, Egypt was considered the cradle of civilization.
Yep, and this is what I mentioned earlier when they talked about Napoleon looking back on these great conquerors such as Alexander. One of the reasons he went was the geopolitical reasons. I think another one was, honestly, that romantic notion of Napoleon placing himself amongst those ancient conquerors, along with these ideas of enlightenment and liberty, which, you know, you can sort of judge how sincere they were.
Yet it was also still mysterious, remaining largely unknown in Europe with an ancient language that hadn't been deciphered. I mean, what treasures might lie there? What discoveries? And in conquering it, Napoleon would be reenacting the campaigns of Alexander the Great, of Caesar, even of the great French Crusader kings of the medieval era. Look, I know how silly that all sounds, but it's important to note that Napoleon and his officers were dead serious about this.
Oh yeah, the thing about Napoleon, one of the interesting things about Napoleon is that, and they mentioned this, he was fantastic at this self-aggrandizing propaganda, right? Propaganda was one of Napoleon's main skills, one of the reasons he got so popular. Throughout his campaigns in Italy, he would write these dispatches back to Paris, you know, just as Caesar had once done, and he would promote his own accomplishments. People would read about them in the newspapers. Napoleon was fantastic about this. But Napoleon also had a very grand view of himself, so sometimes it becomes a little unclear with Napoleon what is self-aggrandizing propaganda that he doesn't necessarily believe, and what is him being egotistical? Like, does he actually believe these things about himself? And at this point in his career, you know, Napoleon is basically starting to huff his own fumes. He's been talking himself up, describing himself as this great man of history, and now he's really starting to believe it, and he does actually want to fill that role. He's not quite there yet, but he really is starting to feel that he does deserve to be talked of alongside those great conquerors like Alexander and Caesar, and one day he will be, but the point is he's really starting to believe it.
In fact, once they left port and he informed them of their destination, the shipboard philosophical debate group he formed to pass the time argued at length about who they resembled the most. Were they more like the Roman legions or Alexander's Macedonians? Ooh, how about Caesar or Octavian? And when they arrived, would each become a Mark Antony with a beautiful Cleopatra-like Egyptian lover? Oh boy. Now, all self-aggrandizing fanfic aside, these sessions actually did help cut the tension, because this voyage was a dangerous one.
Yeah, I mean, when you're bringing it back down to Earth, this was a dangerous voyage, especially on a naval level because of the power of the British Navy. It was just risky overall, so maybe this grand ideas helped them continue. But, remember, this is the Enlightenment era. Well, the tail end of the Enlightenment era, but there's been this big obsession with the classical era, as they talked about. And, throughout the 19th century, following Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, a lot of Europeans will be more exposed to Egyptian culture, and there will be a bit of an Egypt craze throughout the 1800s. People will become very obsessed with Egyptian motifs and architecture and aesthetics. I imagine that might be one of the consequences of this whole campaign.
Nelson's fleet was hunting for them, and the French only slipped by through sailing at night. Their lights doused, and crew told to keep quiet.
Yeah.
First, they made the island.
It was a real risky time, and we're about to see the voyage right now, but the French had to snake their way through the Mediterranean to Egypt, while avoiding the very frightening British Navy.
Of Malta, gateway to Egypt, and still garrisoned by the medieval Knights of Malta.
Yep.
Napoleon took it with minimal resistance. Since the revolution, religious contributions to the order had dried up, and half of the knights were Frenchmen who were unwilling to fight their countrymen. The Grand Master was bought off, and Napoleon stopped long enough to recruit Arabic speakers to serve as translators and intermediaries. Then, July 1st...
Yeah, I believe Napoleon also implemented some enlightened reforms on the island. He arrived to Malta, and he disapproved of basically this feudal organization, because that's what it was. The order was basically a feudal holdover at the end of the 1700s. And so Napoleon did what he did when he went anywhere. We'd already seen this throughout Italy, and he will continue doing this throughout the entirety of his career. He implemented these Enlightenment ideas wherever he went, tried to modernize and liberalize all these different countries and governments. Once again, as with everything in relation to Napoleon, it's up to you to make the decision of how sincere he was being. And I think with everything Napoleon does, there's always a mix. There's a mix of Napoleon sincerely believing in these ideas and Napoleon using these ideas as a battering ram to justify his conquest. To me, it seems like that is almost always the case with Napoleon.
They arrived off Alexandria, and Napoleon gave the address we quoted at the top of this episode, instructing his men how to behave amongst the Egyptians and reminding them that they're entering a city founded by Alexander. They attacked the walls that night, following a short negotiation. In a paltry defense, 500 Mameluke soldiers with century-old muskets tried to guard a medieval wall against 4,000 of Napoleon's modern infantry.
Yeah.
The Mameluke fire was so ineffective that when General Kleber was shot in the forehead, the bullet failed to kill him. The Mamelukes fled, and...
Look, here's the thing, and we're going to see this throughout this series, I imagine. The Mamelukes were just not ready for Napoleon. They just did not have the same advanced technology, the same advanced strategy that Napoleon was using. The Mamelukes were used to, skirmishing amongst each other. There was no chance in hell they were ready for this French force that had just landed in their territory. Now, that's not to say that this was about to go fantastic for Napoleon, and we'll see why, but the Mamelukes really had no chance to resist.
And as light dawned, the French found themselves in possession of the great city of Alexandria. Scholars and officers flooded in to see the jewel of the Ptolemies, to witness the abode of Cleopatra, full of ancient splendor.
Uh-oh.
And wait, what the is this? This is Alexandria?
Yeah.
Are you sure? Where are the palaces and temples and gold and incense and crap? Okay, there's Pompey's column there. Oh, and an obelisk to Cleopatra, and wait, is that it? Hold on, are those guys using a broken obelisk as a bench? Is this hieroglyphic slab holding up a doorway? Why is everyone in rags? What happened to this place?
Yes. So, when the Europeans arrived in Alexandria, they had all these grand ideas in their heads. They were thinking back to the classical era, to Caesar, to Alexander, Cleopatra, Mark Antony. When they arrived, they were deeply, deeply disappointed. It really wasn't what they were expecting. And, of course, there's also the other element, which is they were interacting with a culture very different to their own, and a lot of these Europeans were very disparaging, had a very bigoted attitude towards these native Egyptians. They spoke very disparagingly of the culture, of the people, of the city. They really were not impressed. They didn't find many of them what they came looking for, even though there were discoveries to be made.
The French were absolutely shocked. All they could fathom was that the Egyptians had forgotten their heritage, lost their status as the heirs of the classical legacy, and didn't take care of it. A diagnosis Enlightenment thinkers also ascribed to the Greeks, by the way. But the truth was, Alexandria was just old. Lots had happened in the 2,000 years since Cleopatra and Antony, after all. The course of the Nile changed, devaluing the city as a center of trade. Monuments had suffered the ravages of time, much like Roman buildings in France and Britain. Stones got reused in construction. The whole place had never recovered from its depopulation during the Black Death.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth pointing out, at this point in time, Europe was becoming a more prosperous continent, but for a long time, you want to talk about the Middle Ages, Europe was really not doing so well. You could look at, the eternal city of Rome. Look at Rome during its height under the Roman Empire, and then fast forward, say, 1,000 years to the center of the Middle Ages. Rome itself was a city of ruins. It wasn't what it had once been, so it's not really an uncommon thing for many of these jewels of the ancient world to be rather depopulated. Many of the monuments and architecture hasn't been taken care of. The resources just aren't there.
And Egypt, semi-autonomous under the Mamelukes, was one of the poorest parts of the Ottoman Empire. Napoleon had just arrived, and already Egypt was not what he expected. But surely things would be different in Cairo.
Surely.
French ships began to unload the instruments of war. Cannons, gunpowder, an Arabic printing press to distribute propaganda, and a mobile chemistry lab for the savants to explore and categorize this new land.
Though to my understanding, they said that Napoleon picked up translators from Malta. He was using translators that basically used this very garbled Maltese version of Arabic that was pretty difficult for the natives of the region to understand. So even though Napoleon was ready for this, the printing press and the translators, his translated pronouncements and documents, were pretty difficult to understand for many of the natives.
Everything they would need for a successful campaign. Except for the one thing they didn't bring. Canteens.
Uh-oh.
Which turns out would be pretty important where they're going. I mean, it's not like they were able to order a bunch of nourishing beverages or tasty meals and then have them shipped directly to their location. That could never happen.
All right, and I do believe this is the ad, so please go and check out this video. Go check out their sponsor. Show Extra History support for making this fantastic content. Wow, that was a great first episode. I am very excited to see the rest of this series. What we're going to see, as I mentioned, is that, the Frenchmen they absolutely destroy the Mamelukes. The Mamelukes really don't stand too much of a chance at overall resistance, but because of other complications, because of British interference, because of many other factors, this French campaign is not going to be the glorious conquest that Napoleon had imagined, which, like I said, is really one of the things that makes it so interesting. It's Napoleon at this sort of middle point of his career. There's a lot of different directions he could go, and heading to Egypt, this is what he has selected as his next step. He's looked at his options, he's got a lot of potential, he's already achieved a lot, and he said, okay, what I'm gonna do next is head to Egypt. And yet, as we'll see throughout this series, it ends up maybe not being as consequential as Napoleon would have hoped, and certainly not being as successful as Napoleon would have hoped. Now, we talk about in this video, this was absolutely a consequential campaign, and it will have a lot of effects. But if you look at the trajectory of Napoleon's career, This campaign absolutely did not help him as much as he'd wanted it to. It really, really didn't. Now, he did a good job propagandizing, as he always did, but it really didn't shoot him up to the next level as he had hoped. In many ways, he was sort of as well off as he had been before he came to Egypt, when he arrived back in Paris and returned to the political affairs of the city. But we'll get into all of this throughout this series. Really interesting stuff, an interesting cast of characters. I always enjoy talking about Napoleon. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And if you ring that little notification bell next to the subscribe button, you will be notified whenever I release a new video, so you can keep up with my new reactions to this series or any other videos I am releasing. Anyway, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.